Welcome, everyone. My name is Jan Fisher, and I am the Executive Director of Nonprofit Westchester. My pronouns are she, her. I am thrilled to welcome you to today's Community Assets, a free virtual monthly community education series to connect Westchester residents, employers, and employees to the wealth of government and nonprofit resources designed to optimize personal, family, community, and workforce well-being, and more inclusive and supportive environments in our county. I want to thank the county executive and his team and the Westchester County Board of Legislators for funding this series. This is our second program, and I am thrilled to welcome you to today's program, Pronouns, Allyship, and the LGBTQ plus community, what they mean and why it matters. This is particularly important as we here in Westchester seek to set an authentic and deep example of what it means to foster a respectful and inclusive community where all people are valued. With this in mind, we are so fortunate to have three experts with us for today's presentation. Judy Troilo, Chief Executive Officer of the LOFT, Tejash Sanchala, Executive Director of the Westchester County Human Rights Commission, and Shepard Verbas, Fair Housing Education and Outreach Coordinator, Westchester County Human Rights Commission. I thank all of you for the great deal of time and effort that went into preparing for today, and to Shepard for creating a very powerful presentation. This effort represents the strong relationship between Westchester County government and the nonprofit sector in general, and the particularly strong relationship between the LOFT and the Human Rights Commission. And I do have to give a big shout out to both parties. In these difficult times, the Human Rights Commission has been an incredible source of information to our community in general, and the LOFT continues its work in creating the best possible environment for all people. We will be recording today's presentation, which is really a beginning. I encourage all of you to reach out to the LOFT to bring this and other trainings to your businesses, organizations, or community. We will be sharing the recording in a follow-up email along with other resources, and the information will be on NPW's website as well. Lastly, please chat your questions directly to Shepard. They will be facilitating a Q&A at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. And remember, all questions are important and will be anonymous unless you would like your name to be shared. So with this, Shep, let's begin. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jan. A big shout out to Nonprofit Westchester for inviting us today to speak on this topic, and a huge round of applause for everybody who's joined. I'm going to be sharing my screen and we're going to get started. So if everybody can just let me know if you can see this, then we'll begin. Cool. All right. So as Jan has just mentioned, please make sure that if you do have questions to direct them to me in the chat. My name is Shepard Verbas. You'll see my name pop up. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, all things considered, if we go through this smoothly. But yeah, today we are here to talk about pronouns, allyship, and the LGBTQIA community, what it means and why it matters. This is a 101 kind of meeting. We will be discussing pronoun use, allyship, the importance of inclusion, and I'd love to say that if you'd like a more advanced conversation, an LGBT training, deeper dive on a specific issue that you're facing in your community or in your workplace, please reach out to the LOFT LGBTQ plus Community Center. Their contact information will be shared toward the end. They can talk to you about the issues that you're seeing and design a training specifically for that. All right, so a little bit about us. Jan has already introduced us. but I do just want to share that each of the three of us have a wealth of experience in this topic, personally, professionally. I'm a trans and non-binary educator, and have focused on issues related to trans and non-binary community, queer advocacy throughout my professional career. And I'm deeply humbled to be here with the LOFT and on behalf of the Human Rights Commission. I used to work for the LOFT, and yeah, again, just very happy to be here. So as we dive in, it's really important for all of us to be on the same page regarding the terminology we will be using. So just an overview, when we say LGBT, what we mean is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, transgender, queer, or questioning. This is kind of the most understood and most widely used acronym in the community. You might see LGBT, you might see LGBTQ+. It all means basically the same thing. The plus does symbolize that the list is ongoing, and truly there is no end to the terms that can be added to this acronym. The next one on this screen is TGNC-NB. So that one might be a little bit less commonly used. You might not super be familiar with this, but what that stands for is the gender component of LGBTQ. So transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary. And then the last term that we're going to be using in this presentation and that is used elsewhere is cisgender. So cisgender is any person who does not identify as a member of the TGNC-NB community, or otherwise a person who is not trans or non-binary. You may see this word shortened. You might hear it as cis, similar to how you might hear transgender as trans. But the word cisgender, the Latin root cis, comes, like I said, it's a Latin root and it means on the same side. So essentially, it's just a person whose gender identity has not changed or aligns with the gender they were assigned at birth. So it's really important. You might hear this word a lot, and sometimes people think it's a slur, and it's not. None of these words are inherently offensive. It's really just about the way that you use them. That's like kind of the key, right? We're not calling somebody a derogatory term by saying that they're transgender, similar to how a transgender person saying you're cis isn't offensive necessarily, right? It's just a descriptor word for a gender identity. I wanted to highlight a few figures in the public-facing world because, it's really easy to kind of think, oh, I don't know any trans or non-binary people. But in fact, these four people pictured on the screen are members of the non-binary community. Janelle Monáe, who's a singer, Bella Ramsey, an actor who was in Game of Thrones and also Last of Us. Sam Smith is a singer as well, and Sarah Ramirez, who was in Grey's Anatomy and also is a singer as well. But also even in queer people and trans people are not just in positions of art making and advocacy work. We are also found in every other realm of employment. For example, Dr. Rachel Levine, who uses she, her pronouns, was the former head of the former Pennsylvania Health Secretary, and is now the nation's Assistant Secretary of Health. She's a trans woman. And Senator Sarah McBride, who also uses she, her pronouns, the first openly trans state senator in all of American history, who was appointed in 2020 for the state of Delaware. And I see some questions in the chat already. Thank you so much for those. We'll get to those toward the end. So a person's gender identity. When we're here talking about pronouns, there is a lot of overlap with kind of like the pronouns somebody chooses to use and their identity. And, there's also a lot of confusion between, my gender identity versus a person's sexual orientation versus a person's gender expression. And sometimes those terms can be used interchangeably, which is incorrect, or just confused in general. So we're going to break them down. Gender identity is a person's internal feeling of self, okay? It is not visible, and it is not determined by your genetic makeup or what somebody says you are. It is internal, right? So it's the feeling of being a woman, being female, male, neither, both, and nothing at all. And these are the words that we use to say like a cisgender woman or a transgender guy or whatever that is. So again, just a few definitions. We already defined cisgender and transgender, but to kind of go into non-binary a little bit more, non-binary is an umbrella term that is used by a number of people that can explain a variety of different identities that fall outside of a binary category of gender, meaning male or female. So our society typically, historically, has classified people based on this, you're a woman, so you're female, or you must be feminine, you must marry a man, you must follow these typical norms, or you're a man, you're male, you were a boy, all of these things. And non-binary identity is saying, these rules that were created, they don't feel right to me, and I don't identify as one of those two categories. It really is just as simple as that. Importantly, cisgender, transgender, and non-binary, I like to say, are kind of like adjectives, right? They describe your relationship to gender, and everybody has a relationship to gender, right? Similarly, everybody uses pronouns, okay? So we're not just specifically talking in this presentation about trans people or non-binary people. We're talking about respecting all people and the language that they choose to use for themselves. So when we say transgender, we could be talking about a trans woman, a trans man, a trans person. Non-binary identity as an umbrella term can refer to somebody who identifies as agender or gender fluid or gender flux or gender queer or demigender. And, cisgender, cis woman, cis man, importantly, it is not our responsibility as allies. It's not even our responsibility as people in the community to know definitions for all terms. It really just is our responsibility as human beings to listen to the other person who's sharing with you about their identity and use words that validate that identity, right? So we're not here to be dictionaries. Okay, so that's about gender identity. Remember, that's the internal feeling of who we are inside. But what about how we portray that to other people? I want to pose a question that, if you couldn't speak, how would you communicate who you are to somebody else, right? And the answer is pretty obvious. If you couldn't say, hey, I am this identity, right? You would show it to other people, right? You'd display it. You are already in different ways, right? Your clothing, your hair, the way that you carry your body, your name, your pronouns. Even in this society, the profession that you hold can have ties to gender and gender norms, okay? Whether we like it or not. And all of this compounds and builds what is known as your gender expression, okay? So remember, your gender identity is internal, but your gender expression is this thing that's external. It's the thing that other people see, okay? It's the visible cues. Like I said, the hair and the clothing and, different things that in our world have been said, this is feminine, this is masculine. And included in that, like I said, are our pronouns. So, I use she, her pronouns, and therefore, that is an expression of my femininity, or I use he, him pronouns, and that's an expression of my masculinity, or I use they, them, and because I'm non-binary. These can be really powerful tools for a person to use to say, this is who I am, right? Importantly, it's not our responsibility to patrol the words that people use and or get hung up on the fact that somebody uses a certain pronoun for themselves and then therefore X must equal Y. So there are people in the community who who use pronouns like she, her, and are non-binary, but still feel like the she, her represents their femininity, even though they're not connected to the woman identity, if that makes sense, right? So just because you know a person's pronouns doesn't mean that you know their internal identity of themselves, but nonetheless, you should be using those pronouns, okay? And ultimately, we're not always entitled to know how somebody identifies themselves. And so pronouns can be a really good way to not be invasive, but to still respect somebody. So there are limitations to language. We all, I think, know the limitations to language. Language tends to favor what is common, and what is the same. And so therefore we can have definitions and group consensus and things like that. And also for the LGBTQ community in general, the words that the community has used to describe ourselves have not always been, at least in the public sphere, have not been self-given. They usually come from like a diagnosis or like a clinical framing. For example, homosexuality was a mental disorder until 1974 in the DSM-2. So all of this is to say that, the language that we use for people really holds a lot of weight, okay? And I want to kind of pose, what is the emotional impact of assuming a person's pronouns or gender identity? And what is the emotional impact of misgendering someone after learning their pronouns? Because we are sending these messages we might not even want to be sending when we are not doing our part as an ally to mirror the language other people use for themselves, right? How many times have the queer people in this space been told, you're too old, you're too young, how do you know? Is this for attention? You don't look non-binary. And all of these messages say, why is who I am wrong? Why don't I matter enough to take up some space in your brain? Why don't you think about me and value me as an employee or a member of your community or your family? And really can be super dehumanizing, right? As opposed to reframing this and saying, hey, let's use language the way that people ask us to as a tool for empowerment, and not assume everybody's pronouns and gender as soon as we meet them, asking them, and then correctly using that language for them after we learn, right? I will use the words that make you feel seen and equal. I feel empowered. I feel respected, right? Because ultimately, words like trans and non-binary and things like that are not they're not new, right? They're the groups of people that they describe are not new, I should say. Just because it's now in the public lexicon and is what's new, right? And we don't want to say things like, oh, all these new identities, it's just so confusing, because it really does erase the fact that this community has been a part of humanity forever. Ultimately, it's our job to support people, even if we don't understand everything. And also, be an ally so that we can actively reduce people's feelings of trauma, not re-traumatize them, build and increase trust with other people, do our part to like normalize the trans experience and the fact that non-binary people exist, validate people, and be a model to others, and share empowerment rather than add to somebody's burden, right? So here on the screen are a few tips about being an ally to somebody who might use, they, them pronouns, or be a part of the LGBTQ community or trans person. Know your limits, respect everybody's rights to define themselves. I also included these two images on the side because there is no one way to be an ally. You can just be somebody's friend, a shoulder to lean on, or you can go marching down the street during June with your flag. There's no right or wrong way, but ultimately you want to be active in your allyship. There is really no such thing as, passive allyship, the yay gay, putting a flag up during June and then taking it down and never talking about anything queer again until next June. We don't want to be those types of allies. They're really not helpful. So yeah, let's just strive toward active allyship as we move forward. I kind of want to pose a few questions for thought. Just again, because we do all have our own connection to gender and pronouns and language for ourselves. I find it helpful to frame it in terms of you, in terms of what have I gone through in my life. When I'm, being an ally to other people, because, it's important to find yourself in the work that you're doing, right? So at what point did you realize your own gender? Because there was a point. Have you ever questioned your gender? Have you ever felt like people have boxed you in or placed expectations on you because of your gender? And I'm sure that's probably true, right? And if so, what did that feel like for you? What support did you need when that happened? Did you get that support from other people? What could have made things better for you? You know, because ultimately that can answer questions about what kind of ally you can be. Just do the things that you needed is always a great place to start. And, as we move forward, as I pass the mic to Judy and Tejash, I want us to kind of just, if you want to, take this, write this down, but also just to ponder 3 things that you might have done well up until this point regarding trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary inclusion. 3 ways that you may have caused harm, whether, even unintentionally or unknowingly. And 3 things that you could start to do to be more inclusive moving forward. So I'll leave this for just a second before I pass the mic. And while I'm kind of pausing here before I pass the mic, there is a question I can answer right now that I see in this chat. The distinction between trans and non-binary. So trans identity is any gender identity that is different from the one you were assigned at birth. The typical narrative is, transitioning from point A to point B, but that's false. You can transition to anything, or whatever it is in your heart. And so by that definition, you could say, oh, well, if you are non-binary, you're probably also trans, right? But the important distinction is that all of these terms are personal, right? So a lot of non-binary people say I'm trans and non-binary, right? But there are plenty of non-binary people who are non-binary and don't identify as the label trans for personal reasons. Maybe they don't feel like it fits them. They, whatever it is, I can't be here and talk about, those personal reasons. But so there is a distinction. Transgender and non-binary are both umbrellas, and they often overlap, but they don't always. And that's really the only thing I can say about that distinction in this question. All right, so I'm going to pass this mic and to Judy.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you, Shepard. It's wonderful to work with Shep. One thing that I realize as we go through this process is there's so much information to share. So I wanted to take a minute and just tell folks, the LOFT is the LGBTQ plus center for Westchester County, and we also serve people beyond Westchester County. But I wanted to leave you with this information because we also provide trainings to individual organizations, to institutions, colleges, universities, and other schools in partnership with GLSEN and Center Lane. For those of you who aren't familiar with Center Lane, and I believe there are program directors on, Robin, we partner with Center Lane. They focus on LGBTQ plus youth. So if you're having a situation with the youth and you need some guidance, or you are a youth or a teacher and you want to reach out to Center Lane, we could provide that information toward the end. But the LOFT, we have a helpline, and we provide trainings. So this we consider a very basic training on pronouns. So I want to move forward with this, but know that there's more that we could provide you with. Gender myths and reality. Let's talk about common myth. Number one myth: gender is determined by one's biological sex characteristics. No. The reality is gender is a personal identity. Gender does not automatically exist due to a person's biology. Everyone get that? That's a lot of what Shepard was speaking about earlier. Gender is the same throughout a person's life. If they were a girl as a kid, they will be a woman as an adult. Well, we know that's just not true. And gender is fluid. The reality of it is we all have the freedom to explore it in our own rate. So don't make assumptions about folks. The next one: if you are really trans, you know this at a young age. Not always so. Much of the time, yes, but not always. And we tend to think, I just want to say, we are products of our upbringing. So many things we might feel as children, but we don't know what that means. And we're looking to adults to tell us what that means. So it's really important for adults to be attuned to that, and that you don't say harmful things, especially to children, and you allow them to express themselves and talk openly. Many trans people know they are not trans at a young age, but not everyone. The last myth here is a person's pronouns always indicate their gender identity. Well, that's not true either. As Shepard mentioned early on, some people don't use pronouns at all. Other people will use neopronouns, which Shepard's going to talk to us a bit about. But pronouns are a great form of expression, but do not always reflect the person's gender identity. And again, Shepard will speak about that later. Please, if you have any questions, put them into the chat and we'll address them during the Q&A. Gender language etiquette. Gender identity isn't always apparent. So this is what gets really dangerous. When people make assumptions and misgender someone. It's very painful to folks that have been fighting for their identity to be misgendered. And I always put it back on us as well, as Shepard said. And I'll use an example of myself. I am a cis woman. I use the pronouns she and her, she, her. I will answer to they, them, but they're not my pronouns or she, her. But I have been misgendered for a couple of reasons. I have a very deep voice. So when I'm on the phone with someone, they might say, "Oh, excuse me, sir." Now they're making an assumption there. And I have to tell you, that really makes me angry. And I thought about it and I thought, gosh, can you imagine that happening to you all the time? It's very disrespectful. Another thing is people make assumptions because I have very short hair. Well, I like my hair short. It has nothing to do with me being anyone other than Judy, a cis woman who uses she, her pronouns and happens to be a lesbian or a queer woman. So again, gender identity is different than sexual orientation. Remember that. Common pronouns, he, him. That's typically used for male or masc genders. She, her, typically used for female or femme genders. They, them, typically used for non-binary genders. Using a person's name given at birth. Well, that would be fine for me, right? But you're assuming that, I'm a cis woman. I told you I was. But when you do that to somebody who has gone through a process or is going through a process and they are who they are and who they tell you they are, and you use a name given to them at birth that isn't their name, that's called dead naming someone. And that is probably one of the most devastating things to do to someone, especially repeatedly. If someone is dead named, we deal with it all the time here. Our staff, people that come in, it's emotionally devastating. So please be aware of that. Non-acceptance can completely, add to someone's gender dysphoria. We need to be allies. We need to be aware. And we need to ask people, what is your pronoun? My name is Judy. My pronouns are she, her. What's your name and what are your pronouns? Shep, is there another one going on here?
Yeah, no, I just want to add, like for the conversation that we're having in this moment about pronouns, we're talking about a social transition, right? So when we kind of have these conversations about inclusion and things like that, or the trans community, there is often, this like understanding that trans people all go through this certain process and, all want this certain thing. And, that can look like surgery or whatever it is. And the reality is not all trans people change the language that they use for themselves. Not all trans people change the name that they were given at birth. Not all trans people want surgery or can have surgery or take hormones or anything like that, right? Everybody is an individual. And like I said, the act of changing your name and changing your pronouns are social transitions. So it's the the change in a social setting, doing that. I wanted to say that as kind of like a to categorize the conversation that we're having. And then this last point about gender dysphoria, um, along the lines of, well, all trans people must feel just this intense discomfort around their bodies and the pronouns and the names and the things like that. Gender dysphoria is certainly felt by a majority of trans people or a lot of trans people, but not all trans people experience gender dysphoria, which is that feeling of intense intense emotional reaction toward gendered stimuli, right? In being incorrectly pronounced or not seen correctly by other people. So it's not like a qualification to being trans is to experience gender dysphoria, because I think that kind of just like emphasizes this trope that all trans people are sad, which is not true. But also, if you are misgendering somebody or if you are actively dead naming them, it does definitely amplify feelings of gender dysphoria, which is deeply uncomfortable and very traumatizing. And just in general, the acts of dead naming and misgendering can be dangerous, by intentionally or unintentionally outing somebody to the people around them.
Thank you, Shepard. All right, actually, Shepard, while you're here, we're going to talk about neopronouns. I want you to take this piece.
So, so not to like go too in depth about this topic, but it is definitely important to center the fact that they, them is not the only non-gendered pronoun that a person could use for themselves. There are what is known as neopronouns, which is just like saying like a new pronoun. Here are some examples on the screen. We'll share some examples in the next slide as well. Importantly, neopronouns kind of answer that question of, well, they, them is I already have, an understanding of what that means, and it's not it's a plural word. It's not singular. I can't use it for one person, which is incorrect. The Merriam-Webster dictionary has actually redefined and said they, them is singular, can be used as singular as well as plural. But, there are other words that people use instead of they, them, like I said, that other people don't have associations with, typically speaking, in our language. And then therefore that common excuse of, well, I'm not going to use they, them because it's grammatically incorrect. You can't say that here.
And Shep, can I, before you go on, I just want to bring it back to that saying when people say it's grammatically incorrect, I always ask people to, okay.
Right. Really?
I'm sorry, someone needs to be muted. Someone's not muted. Please mute if you're not. So Shepard, I just want to say the they, them, if you meet someone and you don't know their gender identity, and you are talking about somebody on a playground bringing a ball from the playground into the gym, you would say they brought the ball into the gym. That is used in a singular manner. So, remember those things. When people say they use pronouns they and them, they're not saying for you to refer to them as they, like, hello, they. We're not asking you to do that. We're just asking you to respect the they, them pronouns. Anyway, thank you, Shepard.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, it's not reinventing the wheel of how you use language. Like Judy had just said, like, oh, they parked their car out front. I have no idea who parked their car out front, but I do know that car belongs to one person, and therefore I I use they them because I don't know the gender of the person, right?
Right.
And it's just the right thing to do. It would be
Hmm.
really awkward to say, he parked her car outside. Like I can't even say that sentence. I don't even know if that's correct, right?
Yeah.
But don't reinvent the wheel, don't make it too hard. But yeah, we do use they them as a kind of individual singular pronoun all the time without even realizing it all the time. But here are some examples of other pronouns. Z, zir, zir. The next one is also pronounced z, z, zem, zir. And some of these, importantly, like I said in the beginning, it is not our job to memorize this list. This is actually very much so not inclusive of all of the infinite possibilities that somebody could use. But these are just some examples, right? It's really just important to take it individual, like individual to individual. You say you use these pronouns. I will commit that to memory. I will practice using those pronouns. I will correct myself if I make a mistake, right? Um, but I don't want anybody here to get overwhelmed because you're not going to just go tomorrow and meet 5 different people who use all of these different pronouns. It's not realistically going to happen. And you're probably just going to need to like kind of commit to memory and practice like a few or one or just they them. So step one step at a time. But just it's important to be aware of the fact that other pronouns exist.
All right. We actually pronoun practice. I'm just going to reiterate a lot of what Shepard said, and then we're going to move on to Tejash. Asking for pronouns, share your own pronouns. These are real simple things you can do. When I introduce myself, I say, hi, my name is Judy. I use she, her pronouns. And that gives someone an opportunity to share with me how they identify. And then if they don't, you can ask, how should I refer to you? What pronouns can I use for you? I want to say one thing I dislike tremendously is when people say, what is your preferred pronouns? As if there's a variety of options. If they're my pronouns, they're my pronouns. So remember that when you say preferred, that's like saying, okay, I can call you what you want me to call you, or I can call you something different. So that's important to know. What not to do, using someone's name instead of their pronouns. Now, this is kind of controversial. I want to be clear with folks. Using someone's name is always respectful. What we're saying is don't overuse it or use it instead of pronouns. If I don't know your name and I say, hi, my name is Judy, I use she, her pronouns. And I know their name is Faith. I say, hello, Faith. It's nice to meet you. What pronouns do you use? And then you'll be able to have a comfortable discussion. So when we say don't use someone's name instead of their pronouns, we mean in an unnatural way. Okay. Using they when someone requests a neopronoun or non-binary gender pronoun or binary gender pronoun. We see it, a lot. Just like folks that identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming, if their pronouns are they, them, and you're misgendering them by calling them he or she, that's really disrespectful. But just like somebody who is either cis or trans, let's say a trans female, calling them they, them all the time is also very incredibly disrespectful. It's not a catch-all. People's identity is important. Pronouns are personal. What we are called is fundamental to our identities. It's about respect. Refusing to learn someone's name or pronouns is hurtful and further marginalizes the trans community members. Affirmation makes a difference. Trust me, we do this every day. Creating a safe and affirming space for folks is the best thing you can do. And then the fifth is a study that shows LGBTQ plus youth who were accepted and affirmed by their families were less likely to deal with mental health issues and, quite frankly, die by suicide. Best practices: affirm names and pronouns. Use what people tell you they want you to use. Respect people. Be respectful, ask politely, pay attention to confidentiality and privilege. Are these pronouns public? Trust that person's decision to present themselves. I trust you in telling me who you are at the level you want to share that with me. I'm not going to make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. There we go. That was the last one. I want to go ahead. You can move on to it. And I think now we're moving on to Tejash. And Tejash is my dear friend. And he heads up the Human Rights Commission here in Westchester. And it is an honor to work with him. We work together a lot, and that's how we get things done in Westchester. All yours, Tejash.
Thank you so much, Judy. And I'm really proud to be on the panel with you and Shep today and talk about this important topic. So on this slide, I just wanted to introduce folks to a little bit about the Human Rights Commission and the human rights law for folks who do not know. 25 years ago, the county's Board of Legislators passed the county's human rights law. It was pioneering at that time. And we're really fortunate to have such a strong supporter in the county executive. In 1999, when this law was passed, the county executive was chair of the Board of Legislators. He was a legislator along with Andrea Stewart Cousins and the late Lois Bronze at that time. And together, the three of them championed the law's passage. It was not easy in 1999. There were many opponents that took out full-page ads in local papers stating that, quote unquote, the human rights law officially promotes homosexuality. Quote, the sexual orientation is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And quote, the commission will become an indoctrination program for the gay lifestyle. People voiced their objections at multiple public hearings. After much debate, the human rights law was passed in December of 1999, and the commission was created in the following March. So those were protections that were added for sexual orientation discrimination protections in December of 99 when they were not included under state or federal law at that time. And it's only recently that they've been included under federal law based on cases that have come out. That ad now hangs in our conference room. And it reminds us of where we've come and how far we have to go from here. And 10 years later, from 1999 to 2009, the county was again ahead of the curve when it added gender identity and gender expression as protections under the human rights law and fair housing law. They weren't covered under the comparable federal or state anti-discrimination laws at that time either. In Westchester County, individuals have the right to fair housing, equal employment, access to public accommodations, regardless of their gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation. At the commission, we conduct a robust education outreach program, and we enforce the county's human rights law. How do we enforce it? We accept, investigate, and adjudicate complaints of discrimination in employment, housing, place of public accommodation, certain hate-related issues. We can award damages, monetary damages, and equitable relief after hearing for an administrative law judge if it's appropriate. And you think about these protections that Judy and Shep talked about, and what we're here learning about is you might take some of these anti-discrimination protections for granted, but in the current environment, I think you can see why you should not. And these are hard-won protections that we have to continue to safeguard. So if you look at this slide, and by the way, I was happy that Shep was doing the part where folks are thriving, because my piece is not so much about people thriving, but more about resources for the community to know what is happening. I'm hoping many of you are familiar with the Human Rights Campaign. It is the largest LGBTQ civil rights not-for-profit organization. It declared a national state of emergency last year due to an increase in the anti-LGBTQ bills At the last time I looked, I believe there are over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been proposed across the country. The Human Rights Campaign released a report called LGBTQ Americans Under Attack. It's this historic spike in legislation coinciding at a time where legislators feel so freely nationwide in using anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. Most recently, you may have read an Oklahoma state senator refer to community members in the LGBTQ group as quote unquote filth. And that's not a one-off, unfortunately. Last year, the ADL and GLAAD released a first of its kind report, finding that there were more than 350, I'm just going to repeat that, 350 incidents of harassment, vandalism, and assault that occurred between June of 2022 and April of 2023. And that number didn't even include the 145 reported incidents of anti-LGBTQ violence, harassment, vandalism that occurred during Pride Month in 2023 alone. And if you look at these incidents, you can see that they occurred in 46 states across the country, and it gives you a sense of how pervasive the bias against the LGBTQ community has become. And if you want to just think about this, is that the fear and this rhetoric is not just limited to the United States. Last week, the parliament in Ghana passed a bill which criminalizes relationships and sexual activity in public displays of affection between members of the LGBTQ community. That bill has been forwarded to the president to be signed into law. Uganda passed a similar law last year. And if you just want to think about, for folks who are on this Zoom, think about your privilege. If you don't have to think about your vacation plans and whether you could be jailed for traveling overseas because of who you love or your identity. Next slide. So going back to Westchester County, I just want to highlight the protections under the county's human rights law and fair housing law. In Westchester County, discrimination is prohibited in employment and housing, places of public accommodation, and discriminatory harassment, which covers certain hate-related incidents that may occur on the street, between neighbors in single-family homes, in parks. I'm going to touch briefly on each one of these slides, or each one of these points. So in Westchester County, you have the right to be free from discrimination or harassment based on your actual or perceived gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. There are about 15 others protected categories. I'm not going to speak about those today, except for a couple later on. But if you have questions about some of the other protected categories, call me. Call me or Shepard. We're happy to speak to you. The county's human rights law applies to all employers in Westchester County, even those with one employee. The only caveat is the Human Rights Commission does not have jurisdiction over the county's workforce. So those types of matters can be referred to a federal or state agency. The human rights law protects domestic workers, interns, independent contractors from discrimination as well. And discrimination can occur at all phases of the employment relationship, from the recruitment to the separation. And there's a report that New York State just put out 2 months ago. Actually, exactly 2 months from today. On January 4th, the New York State Department of Labor released a report on transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary New Yorkers in the workplace. It's a first of its kind report, and it's a wonderful resource that talks about the serious challenges that the community faces in the workplace. I'll include a link, or Shep will include a link to that report in the chat. I highly recommend you look at the report. I just want to share some highlights from that report. The current environment has caused a lot of people to feel insecure about their standing in the workplace. 15% of respondents reported losing a job at some point in their lifetime due to their gender identity or gender expression. 26% reported being fired or denied a promotion or denied a job that they applied for in the last year because of their gender identity or gender expression. Almost 1 out of 4 people reported workplace abuse due to their gender identity. And then a separate report recently found that resumes that included the they, them pronouns are less likely to be selected for phone screens or called in for interviews. I wanted to talk about a specific case because I think it's important for understand, here are the legal terms, here are the legal consequences, but I want to see how they play out in an actual case. And the EEOC, which is the Federal Employment Agency nationwide, had brought a case against a restaurant in upstate New York. And in that case, you'll see the slide, it's on the slide. And in that case, it was alleged that the owners and the staff of the restaurant verbally harassed Quinn Gambino, a transgender man. They made derogatory references to his transgender status, including telling him that he wasn't quote unquote a real man. They asked invasive personal questions about his transition and genitalia. The lawsuit also alleged that the owners repeatedly and intentionally misgendered Gambino by using female pronouns and failed to correct the inappropriate use of the pronouns by its employees and its customers who did the same. The employee ultimately felt that they had no choice but to resign. The lawsuit was ultimately settled for $25,000, and the EEOC was able to obtain equitable remedies, which is critical. And the remedies talk about that the owners, the managers, and all the employees have to complete a training on anti-discrimination employment laws with a special emphasis on gender identity and gender expression. And the EEOC is going to maintain oversight on whether the employer actually properly implements this training and complies with other terms of the settlement agreement. But this case I highlight to you because it shows you how using the wrong pronouns or dead naming somebody, topics that Judy and Shep both talked about, can form the basis for legal liability and a possible hostile work environment claim in the workplace. I want to just talk about the last slide here is about pronouns. I think having pronouns in your employee signature can be a really helpful tool in building an inclusive workplace. I use them in my email signature along with an article telling people why I do that. And using pronouns can be really helpful for cisgender folks like me. Many people have never met someone named Tejash. But from my email signature, they know I identify as a male and I use he, him pronouns. But employers should be cautious about making it mandatory, because if you make it mandatory, you may make some employees feel uncomfortable. They may not feel comfortable sharing their public information with their personal information with their team members. So you may have a good intent, but it could cause harm if you don't handle it properly. Next slide, Shep. So housing, everyone in Westchester County has the right to obtain housing free of discrimination or harassment based on their gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. I'm always amazed by this statistic. There is an estimated 4 million instances of housing discrimination that take place every year. Only a tiny fraction are reported. For example, a landlord cannot refuse to rent to you based on your gender identity or gender expression. A landlord cannot harass you because of your gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. During the pandemic, there was a reported rise in instances of sexual harassment involving landlords who were preying on vulnerable tenants, saying, wink, wink, there are other ways you can pay your rent. Clearly, a landlord is not permitted to sexually harass its tenants. And the last one I'd highlight here and is source of income discrimination, because it's a timely topic. A landlord cannot refuse to accept somebody who has a Section 8 housing choice voucher. I just wanted to flag that issue for folks here as well. Marlene Zarfis from WRO is on this call, so feel free to reach out to me or Marlene or Shep if you want to talk a little bit more about housing discrimination issues. Next slide. So similarly, everybody in Westchester County has the right to access and use places of public accommodation free from discrimination, whether it's based on their gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. What's a place of public accommodation? That includes restaurants, bars, hotels, theaters, stores, libraries, pharmacies, doctor's offices, and more. This slide makes a reference to a couple who alleges that they were discriminated against because they alleged that they were removed from a New York City restaurant based on their gender identity and or sexual orientation, if I recall correctly. Next slide. I think everybody on this group, I'm hoping everybody on this group understands that we are more than one part of our identity. Intersectionality recognizes that discrimination against LGBTQ members extends beyond their gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. It looks at their intersecting identities of gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, race, disability, and more. And importantly, this intersectionality shows how the experiences of discrimination can be compounded and intensified. LGBTQ individuals are more likely to identify as being disabled, and this duality increases the amount of discrimination that they can face in the workplace, in their housing, or during their daily lives. It is estimated that 3 to 5 million LGBTQ people live with one or more disabilities in the United States. This slide includes data from 2019. To give you some background, 1 out of 4 US adults identifies with a disability. That includes physical disabilities and non-obvious disabilities. Whereas in the LGBTQ community, 36% of individuals identify with a disability. And I bring this up because disability discrimination is the #1 basis for administrative housing discrimination complaints filed nationwide. Individuals with a disability may request a reasonable accommodation in their housing connected to their disability, seeking an emotional support animal, a parking space, or a ramp so they can access their home and have ingress and egress to their housing. Shep does a lot of outreach for fair housing at the commission. Feel free to reach out to me or Shep if you want to discuss a specific issue. And in employment, issues of reasonable accommodations are on the rise as well. And I flag this just because long COVID has been recognized as a potential disability based on the circumstances. And that 1 out of 4 number of US adults, I think that statistic was taken pre-pandemic. It may be slightly higher now. And finally, I wanted to highlight one of Judy's all-star teammates, and that's Dante Hudson. Dante Hudson is the Chief Operating Officer of the LOFT. He recently shared a letter about the intersectionality of the LGBTQ community and race. I encourage you to look at that letter. Next slide. So this is where I was talking about I'm not in the thrive part of the presentation. According to the latest FBI hate crime report covering 2022, it showed that anti-LGBTQ hate crimes were up sharply from 2021. There was a 13.8% increase in reports based on sexual orientation and a 32.9% increase based on hate crimes based on gender identity. And last month, in a historic case, a defendant, first defendant ever after a jury trial, was found guilty of a hate crime motivated by gender identity. So these are things I want you to be aware of and understand the environment that we're currently in. Now, experts have said one of the best ways to combat hate is through robust enforcement of civil rights laws. In December of 2021, in a proactive move, the county expanded the jurisdiction of the Human Rights Commission to address instances of hate that were occurring in areas that are traditionally not in our jurisdiction or were not in our jurisdiction, like incidents that occurred on streets, in parks, or between neighbors in single-family homes. As of December 2021, those instances are now covered. In general, discriminatory harassment covers injury to a person or damage to property based on hate-motivated bias. You must be able to identify who the perpetrator is. This is not intended to infringe on anyone's First Amendment rights. We look at whether there's conduct plus hateful language, and it does not prevent anybody from going to law enforcement. An individual can still file a complaint with law enforcement. They can also file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. There is a 1-year statute of limitations, but what it does is it provides people another forum and another avenue to obtain justice for a survivor of a hate crime. And there's different remedies you would get in a criminal proceeding and a civil proceeding. These are highly fact-sensitive cases, but I'm happy to talk to anybody about that separately offline as well. Next slide. So in general, the Human Rights Commission doesn't have jurisdiction in educational discrimination cases, but in light of the current environment, I wanted to share some information for you as a resource, particularly because the FBI recently stated that schools were the 3rd highest location for hate crimes in the United States over a 5-year period. So there's 3 resources on this slide. The first resource on the slide is about the Dignity for All Students Act, otherwise known as DASA. DASA provides public school students, K through 12, with a safe and supportive environment free from discrimination, intimidation, taunting, harassment, and bullying, whether it occurs on school property, on a school bus, or at a school function. It's important to understand it is not limited to just bias-based bullying. Students can make a complaint to the school's DASA officer. The second resource is the United States Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and that is a federal agency. Schools have a legal obligation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to provide students with an environment free from discrimination based on gender, race, color, and national origin. And in November, the OCR sent out a reminder to schools about this legal obligation so that they were aware of it. And then the third resource is about the New York State Division on Human Rights. That agency has jurisdiction and investigates complaints about educational discrimination. So there's the link there for all three of those. We will share those links with you, so don't feel like you need to write them down. They are not tiny URLs, and we will share them in a follow-up email with you. Next slide. And to give you some idea of what are some of the potential remedies if somebody files a complaint at the Human Rights Commission, if there is a finding that there's probable cause that discrimination occurred and the matter should move forward before an administrative law judge for a hearing, the administrative law judge can recommend remedies such as compensatory damages, punitive damages, and in order to cease the discriminatory conduct. Next slide. And then I think this one's going to kind of go in little parts. So in this current environment where people are trying to promote fear, it's important to think about how you can be an ally. And when I say an ally, I mean it as a verb, similar to how Shep was talking about it earlier on, and similar to how Judy mentioned it. So I always think about Reverend Niemöller's words during World War II and how they still resonate today for across many communities. First, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one to speak for me. And I hope this program today helps you think about how you can be an effective ally in your community and stand up for everyone, not just those that are in your community per se. And I'm always reminded about civil rights pioneer Marsha P. Johnson, who said, history isn't something you look back on. It is, and say it was inevitable. It happens because people make decisions that are sometimes very impulsive and of the moment, but those moments are cumulative realities. Next slide. And this is just our last slide with our contact information. And what we talk about often is no one should feel being harmed or threatened because of their identity or who they love. The Commission is a resource. If you experience discrimination in any of the key areas of your life and employment, in housing, a place of public accommodation, or whether you're walking in the street or at a park or between your neighbor, feel free to contact our office if you want to discuss a specific situation. Our contact information is on this slide. If you don't feel comfortable reaching out to us with your name, you could also do it anonymously through our website. You can report a hate incident or discrimination incident on our website. The link is on this page. And finally, this was a very high level 101 overview of these issues. I cannot echo more of what Shep and Judy said. Is the LOFT is a wonderful partner, and they offer much deeper trainings that could be more applicable to your community organization or just your neighborhood. So you may want to think about not only how can those workshops help you build inclusivity, but if you're an employer or you're an organization, they can help you with employee retention and satisfaction. Those are two key areas that a lot of employers today are facing. So I just want to say thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Judy now.
Hi, everyone. Oh, thank you, Tejash. I'm done. You did my part. I'm going to hand it over to Jan and just say thank you, everyone, for attending today.
So I'm thrilled to, have these experts with us to provide all this information. We have just a couple of more minutes left. Shep can stop sharing the screen and answer some questions. NPW has another another meeting, a Zoom meeting happening at 3:30, but we can, as long as people want to stay on till 3:25. Sorry, we went a little over. Shep, I will hand it over to you, and you can begin to answer some of the questions. And for the questions we don't get to, we'll do our best to get those answered as well. So thank you, everyone, for caring and for attending. And thank you to Westchester County again for being such an amazing partner. Shep, it's yours now.
Okay. So there's a question here. It says, and also please feel free to send other questions if you're just thinking of them now. But this question says, my teen daughter's best friend's pronouns are he, him, and uses a chosen name. However, his mother refers to him as she, her, and his dead name. So I try not to use the child's name or pronouns when the mom is present. How would you suggest I approach this with the mom, who I don't know well? So I'll first pass that to Judy, unless you want me to take the first swing.
Shep, I want you to take it. I'm just sitting here thinking, wow, yeah, that's one that would take some time to kind of wrap your mind around.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I think this is a really great question because I know that this comes up a lot. Judy did touch on this, that it's important when you're learning somebody's, pronouns and they might be new, to kind of figure out who that person uses those pronouns around. And in this case, a parent, it's really harming when, somebody's outed to parents. So I mean, it's case by case. There's no one blanket answer I could give. I don't know the situation personally. But it is always the best kind of thing to do is just kind of follow the young person's lead. Maybe ask them, hey, you use this in front of me. How do you want me to refer to you in front of your mom? I don't think it's a problem to err on the side of caution. But personally, I do think that it's a good idea to involve that young person in that conversation so that they have that sense of like ownership in the process. But ultimately, we don't want to out anybody. So
Right. And
so yeah.
it also depends. It's, how old is the child? If the child is 13, 14 years old, that's a conversation you definitely need to involve the child in because the child might not want you speaking for them. That's important to note. I would say if this individual wants to talk about it further, give us a call over at the loft. We have staff here that might be able to help you work through it. Yeah.
And there was a follow-up actually just came in. It said that the mom isn't supportive. So again, talk to the kid, see what the kid ultimately wants you to do. But honestly, the best thing that you can do is make sure that the environment that kid is coming to, your place, is affirming and uplifting them so that they get all of the support they're not receiving at home. There are limits to allyship. There are limits to what you are able to do. And so I think just knowing in this specific situation, what is, the best way that I can support you, would be a good question to ask.
Can I just add one point?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's important also just highlight that the Loft works closely with GLSEN. And GLSEN is an organization that specifically provides assistance and support to LGBTQ students. And so there are resources that are available and that are geared towards students. So it's important for somebody to reach out to Judy, and even if it's maybe not something they handle directly, but they can certainly connect you with the right resources.
Yes. And again, there's Center Lane, there is there's GLSEN and there's our own staff here. So if we can help you, we're going to connect you to those who can.
And can I just ask a question related to this? I'm taking a liberty here, but I would assume the same applies in the workplace. If you are friends with a colleague and you know something about them that they may or may not have shared with the rest of the workplace, you should always, proceed with engaging that person with what they may want to or not want to share in the workplace as well.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's ultimately the other person's decision. It's important to have that sense of autonomy. And the last thing that you want is to be the person spreading information about somebody else that really doesn't have anything to do with you. So yeah, to keep things confidential, to ask a person if they come out to you, who knows, or how can I support you, or questions like that are very helpful. Just quickly, somebody said you mentioned demigender. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And again, I'll say it's not your responsibility to know every single term and how to define it. And the definition of individual terms are going to be so specific to the person that's using it. But Google just told me that the definition of demigender is people who feel a particular connection to a particular gender identity, which literally doesn't mean anything that's helpful in this context. It can include identities like demi-girl, demi-boy, demi-androgen. Demi-gender, from what I understand, is like a semi-connection to gender. Maybe you don't feel all the way connected to that gender identity, like demi-girl, but like you have a partial connection to it. But I'm sure that it means different things, to different people. So again, it's not our responsibility to know. It's more our responsibility to uplift. And if you had a close connection to somebody who said that to you, you could even ask them, hey, what does this mean to you? But just know, again, your place in the conversation. Do you need to know that information? But if you're like a parent or a best friend or something like that, and somebody says that to you, it's okay to kind of clarify if that's something that's valuable. Any other questions? Any advice for parents of transitioning children? We are very supportive, but we don't always have the right answer or advice. So the first thing I'll say is the LOFT is a resource for parents who have children who are transitioning. WJCS Center Lane is a resource as well. It's okay if you don't always know. But it is important to kind of connect to, somebody said, find your community. Mid-Hudson Proud Families on Facebook is a shout out. It is important to kind of find your group. Just answer questions, as openly as you can. It's okay if you're navigating things at the same time as the person in your life who is navigating things. It can also build a relationship and a sense of trust to be open and transparent about what you don't know. So it's okay to not have all of the right answers, as long as you're like actively educating yourself and seeking out people who can help you. Can you speak about the word queer and how it is used currently? Judy, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, how it's used currently. Well, first of all, this is about pronouns, but people can identify as genderqueer. How it's used is I think years ago, it was a term that was an insult, a slur. And like many names that communities have taken on, as Shepard referred to easier, they're not names we've made up, and they came out of different things. Like homosexuality was actually, a DMS2 term. But queer use of, even when I was a kid, calling someone queer, it was like, now, I mean, it's a very empowering word for our community, and queer can mean just about anything for anybody. It could be related to gender identity or sexual identity or just way of thinking. I think queer is a great word, and it's a word that's used to empower. I identify as queer. What does that mean? For me, it means that I am, I'm a queer woman. I am who I am, and I am a lesbian, or for lack of a better term, queer is anything. Although there are folks of older generations from our community that still have difficulty with that term, because for them it meant an insult.
Everybody was on?
It meant an insult. So what we say is, respect the way that people use it. And if somebody is offended by it, I certainly wouldn't use it around them unless somebody else identified that way. And I had to, give that person their space to identify as they wish. Queer's a good word. Queer's a good word.
It can be to some people, yeah. I want to be mindful of time So it is 3:20. If you do have any additional questions, I know that there were a few that we didn't get to. Just please feel free to reach out to either one of our organizations. We are here to help. That's what we do.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for your time. And I
I'm
hope
gonna
you have
wrap
a
it up
great
a
rest of
bit.
your day.
I'm going to wrap it up for a second. So, first of all, thank you so much. I think this was amazingly supportive. I do see a lot of nonprofits on this. I want to shout out two NPW sponsors from the business community that are here and have made a commitment to learning as much as they can. We have New York Presbyterian Hospital and Webster Bank. I think it's great that the business sector gets involved, and this is not just information. We don't want to just preach to the choir in terms of, I've had organizations reach out to me and say, oh, I'll tell my LGBTQ affinity group about this. We want this information that we're sharing with the public to be spread wide and far. So to our sponsors that are on this from the business sector, again, New York Presbyterian, Ellen Bloom, Webster Bank, Andrea Cantor, thank you for your support. And thank you for showing up in a real meaningful way and taking the time to do this. It means a lot. We want this to be about community. And again, to Westchester County and the Westchester Board of Legislators and to the Human Rights Commission and the LOFT. Thank you everyone for being here. Means a lot.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Jan.
Jeff, Judy, Tejash, you're awesome. Thank you for the work you do. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. It was a great program. Thank you so much.